Margaret sat by the window, a cold cup of tea in her hand, watching Jessica and her boyfriend laughing in the living room as if she were invisible. Outside, the wind pressed its fingers against the old glass, carrying the kind of chill that crept into the bones of a house, and the woman who no longer felt at home inside it. Margaret stared at the pale tea swirling in her cup, untouched, flavourless. It had gone cold quickly, as if mimicking her presence in the house. Just yesterday, Jessica had said lightly, "Mum, you don't have to leave the room, we can cook for ourselves." The sentence had sounded generous on the surface, but the way Jessica had glanced at Paul while saying it, as if seeking his approval, made Margaret shrink a little inside. They were laughing now. Margaret couldn't hear the words, only the bursts of joy, the inside jokes that excluded her without needing to. The distance wasn't measured in rooms, but in glances, not given silences filled with other voices. She tried not to look directly at Paul, who sat relaxed on the couch like he belonged there. She had never quite known what to make of him, always polite, always present, but with a chill behind his courteous tone, like a door that looked open but never welcomed you in. Margaret rose quietly and went to the kitchen. The teapot was light. She reached for the kettle, cleared her throat gently, a small sound, to ask permission, really. Jessica's voice floated in from the living room. "Mum, it's fine. We've got everything under control," that we echoed longer than it should have. Dinner arrived without invitation. Jessica moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, Paul chopping vegetables like it was his home. They didn't ask Margaret to sit. Jessica placed 2 plates at the table and gestured toward the wine. Margaret stood at the far end of the kitchen, wiping the same corner of the counter over and over. Her stomach didn't protest. It was used to waiting. Jessica lifted her glass and smiled. "Babe, you're amazing. We should have dinner parties here. Maybe even redo the kitchen." Paul chuckled. "Maybe change the name of the place too. Something younger." The words floated into Margaret's ears like whispers against glass. This was her house. She and her late husband had spent decades moulding it into a home. The paint, the cabinets, even the worn floor near the back door, they all held memories. And now they wanted to rename it, as if changing the name could erase who had made it. Margaret collected their empty plates after they'd finished moving with quiet grace, careful not to let anything clatter. She washed dishes by hand. Jessica didn't like the dishwasher running too late. It made the house feel too industrial. From the corner, Paul's voice drifted in, "Maybe we can clear that back room too, it's hardly used." Jessica didn't pause. "If Mum doesn't contribute anything, it's best to find another place." The sentence dropped like a coin in a silent room rolling around before settling in the pit of Margaret's chest. She didn't reply, didn't look at them. She dried her hands, turned off the tap, and returned to her seat by the window. The tea had gone cold long ago. Margaret looks at the cold cup of tea, saying nothing, but her fingers tremble, tightening the handle of the cup. Margaret opens an old drawer and finds a copy of the house transfer contract, without the final signature. The cold morning pressed through the walls, slipping beneath doors and curling into corners like a quiet trespasser. Margaret stirred before the sun rose. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone trying not to wake the ghosts in the house, Jessica Paul, or the past itself. Downstairs in the basement, the air was dry and metallic. The light bulb flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across dusty boxes and shelves. She hadn't come down here in months, not since last spring when Jessica asked her to start putting old things away. She remembered Jessica's voice from the night before. "This house is in my name. You don't have to worry anymore." The words had settled into Margaret's chest, like fog, thick, hard to breathe around but impossible to grasp. Her fingers brushed across a wooden box with a broken brass latch. It used to hold family tax files and pension records. She knelt beside it, joints aching in protest. The lid creaked open to reveal layers of folders curled and yellowed at the edges. She sifted slowly. Utility bills, letters from old neighbours, a faded Christmas card from her late husband's brother, and then a white folder thinner than the others, neatly labelled in her late husband's handwriting, House, Title Transfer. Margaret held her breath and opened it. Inside a photocopy of the house transfer document. The typed lines were still crisp, the notary seal faint but legible. Her name. Jessica's name. The outline of the agreement. But at the bottom, where there should have been a signature, was only a blank space. She stared at it, lips parted. There was no final signature. No legal closure. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from the cold. A voice echoed in her mind, clearer than expected. Her husband's voice. Calm, measured, always steady. Don't sign anything without reading it carefully, Mags. Especially if it's about the house. Had she followed that advice? She remembered a long afternoon at the kitchen table with Jessica and a real estate agent. Tea growing cold papers stacked. She had felt rushed, tired. There had been confusion, but she had trusted, or tried to, and yet this copy suggested something else. Margaret looked through the folder again. No original, just the photocopy. Where had she put the signed version? Did she even sign it at all? She pulled the rest of the box toward her and began searching. Folders shifted corners, snagged the scent of mildew rising from the past. Then her fingers touched the corner of an envelope, unopened, thick, sealed. The kind of envelope banks used for formal notifications. She drew it out. It was labelled Asset Linked Bank File. Confidential. The postmark read last year. She had never seen it before. Her thumb hesitated at the seal, but her eyes locked on the corner where the logo sat. A silver emblem. Ivy Bank. Jessica had once mentioned closing their Ivy Bank account, saying they'd switched to something more modern. Margaret stared at the envelope. She pauses, eyes wide, because the logo on the envelope is the bank Jessica mentioned, but said she cancelled the account. Get a job or get out. Jessica screams when Margaret refuses to give her $500 more for the house repair. The words hit like a slap sharp and loud, bouncing off the tiled kitchen walls before settling into the silence that followed. Margaret stood at the counter, fingers still wrapped around the handle of the teapot. The scent of Earl Grey drifted faintly in the air, cut short by the shriek that now echoed in her chest more than in the room. It had been a long, grey day. The cold outside had thickened, settling into the corners of the house like dust. Margaret had woken early, folded laundry, made soup, refilled the bird feeder. She had even polished the wooden table that Jessica now banged her purse on. Jessica stood near the doorway coat, still on face, flushed with fury. Her hands shook, not with cold, but with something deeper tangled between frustration and entitlement. I told you, Jessica said again, voice rising. The contractor's coming Friday. The roof isn't going to fix itself, and the bank. She stopped short, jaw clenched. It doesn't matter. Just give me the money. You're living here for free after all. Margaret blinked slow. I already gave you the check for the plumber. Jessica scoffed. That was nothing. I need 500 more. Don't you have your little pension thing? Margaret turned away to pour the tea. The cup was delicate ivory china with a fading rose pattern. It had belonged to her mother. She lifted it with steady hands and said softly, No. Jessica's voice turned sharp. No. What do you mean? No, I mean no. Margaret repeated, placing the pot back on the warmer. The silence snapped. Jessica slammed her hand against the counter. "Get a job or get out." The shout startled even Paul, who had appeared briefly in the hallway, phone in hand. He paused, eyes flicking between the two women, then wordlessly turned and headed up the stairs. Margaret's hand tightened on the teacup. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply stood still. Then the cup slipped. The porcelain hit the tile with a sound too soft for how hard it felt. A crack, then a scatter. The pieces lay at her feet, white shards with pale pink veins, like a broken promise made long ago. Margaret bent down slowly. Her knees ached, but she moved with care, picking up the larger pieces first. Her fingers brushed the jagged edge. She didn't bleed. Jessica watched from the doorway, still heaving with anger. But something in Margaret's silence unnerved her. There was no pleading, no wounded expression, no raised voice. Just quiet movement. "Unbelievable," Jessica muttered. She grabbed her bag, yanked open the front door, and stepped into the night. The wind swept in briefly, sharp, bitter. Margaret flinched, but not from the cold. The door slammed behind Jessica, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen with the broken china scattered all over the floor. She stood slowly, dustpan in hand, the sharp edges already in her grasp. Her eyes, once dulled, had something else now, watchfulness. "Stillness with purpose," Margaret whispers. "No one knows whose house they're living in." Margaret flips through an old winter coat hanging in the basement. A brown envelope falls out of the pocket. The basement was quiet, except for the distant creak of floorboards above and the hum of the furnace in the corner. It was Saturday morning, and Jessica had left early to meet friends in town. Paul, as usual, had vanished somewhere without a word. The house was still. Margaret sat on the top step for a long minute before descending. One hand traced the banister, the other clutching a small flashlight. The light from the bulb overhead was too dim, casting soft shadows over cardboard boxes and suitcases lined along the wall. She reached the row of hanging coats, thick, unused, still carrying scents of winters long past. Her hand moved across them one by one, the blue puffer jacket Jessica had outgrown Paul's rarely worn overcoat, and at the very end, a sheep wool-lined winter coat, brown and heavy. It was hers. She hadn't worn it in years. As she pulled it from the hanger, the faint scent of cedar and dust rose into the air. The wool collar brushed her cheek as she folded it over her arm, and she noticed a small bulge in one of the side pockets. Her heart stirred. She reached in and felt the edge of paper. A moment later, a thick brown envelope slid out and dropped lightly onto the concrete floor. Margaret stared at it, then slowly bent to retrieve it. The flap was unsealed, worn, soft at the edges. Margaret remembered now, barely but clearly enough. She had once said aloud to herself while folding laundry that she needed to hide something where Jessica wouldn't care to look. Old clothes, forgotten by everyone else. She opened the envelope. Inside, a few neatly folded pages rested yellowed but intact. Her fingers moved over the first, a notarized copy of a will dated October 2009. The name at the top made her chest tighten, David Elaine Carson. Her husband. She sank slowly to the step behind her, the weight of memory folding over her like a warm but heavy quilt. The will was signed in blue ink, her husband's careful looping handwriting unmistakable. She read through it, line by line. In clear terms, it stated, "All physical assets, including the house at 47 Barley Drive, shall remain under the sole ownership of Margaret Ellen Carson, unless revoked in writing." Her breath caught. It wasn't revoked. Not officially. And this was notarized. Behind the will was a small sheet of stationery with her husband's handwriting again. It read, "If anything happens, stay calm. You'll know what to do." The sentence was simple, steady, like him. Margaret sat in silence. She thought back to the day they had gone to see the lawyer. David had insisted she keep a copy of everything just in case. They had walked back home under the fall leaves, and he had made tea for both of them afterward without asking. He always knew when she needed it. Her eyes moved back to the notarized page, and then she noticed something. Near the bottom, below the notary stamp, was the signature of a witness. The name leapt out. Gregory S. Hartley. The name rang loud in her ears. Jessica had once spoken of him briefly, almost dismissively. Oh, that lawyer. He retired years ago. No one knows where he is. But here his name was in ink, real, present, official. Margaret's heartbeat thudded softly in her chest. She quietly folds the papers, returns them to the envelope, and places it back into the coat pocket, carefully smoothing the flap closed. She quietly closes the envelope, puts it back in her pocket, and whispers, "Maybe I haven't lost yet." The phone rings at noon. A deep female voice asks Mrs. Margaret Davis, "This is Grace Adams." Margaret's hand froze above the teacup, the same chipped one she had glued days ago. The phone's ring felt almost foreign. Few people called the landline anymore. Jessica preferred texts, brief, clipped often without a greeting. Telemarketers were more common than voices from the past. She reached for the receiver with quiet hesitation, pressing it to her ear. "Yes, this is Margaret." The voice on the other end was calm, aged, and unmistakably warm. "Mrs. Davis. This is Grace Adams. I used to work at Concord Mutual. You may not remember me, but we met years ago. I helped you and your husband finish the estate paperwork." Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of the living room couch. A shaft of light fell through the window blinds, striping the rug in warm bars. "I remember," she said softly. "There's something I think you should know." Grace continued, her tone now carrying a subtle weight. "I was going through some old case files, well, cleaning out, actually. I'm retired now. But I found the original estate record from 2009. It seems it wasn't properly saved in the system." Margaret's free hand drifted to the folder she had placed in the drawer just days ago, the one with her husband's will, his signature in blue ink, and the witness's name, Gregory S. Hartley. "I thought that was all filed," Margaret said, voice careful. "It should have been," Grace said gently. "I thought it was. But the internal system was changed a few years ago. And when I looked up your name recently on a hunch, I saw it was missing. No record of the property being held in your name. At least not clearly." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches. A crow cawed once sharp against the stillness. "I still have the hard copy," Grace said, her voice softening. "Your husband asked me to keep it as a backup. Just in case something goes sideways," he told me. "I think he had a good instinct." Margaret didn't speak right away. Her fingers tightened around the phone knuckles, pale against the cream-colored cord. "He always read the fine print," Margaret murmured. "Said paper trails mattered more than good intentions." Grace chuckled faintly. "He was right. That's why I'm calling. I want to give it to you in person. No mail. Too many hands these days." Margaret looked across the room toward the closed door of the guest bedroom. Jessica's voice was absent, the house hushed. Mrs. Davis Grace said gently, "I think your daughter may have been in a hurry. She still has a lot to hold on to." The words landed quietly, but did not fade. They settled into Margaret like tea, steeping in silence, warm, slow, revealing flavor over time. Margaret's lips parted. "Would you meet me at the town library next week?" There was a pause. Then, "Of course. Just say when." It would be the first time Margaret left the house for something that wasn't groceries or pharmacy pickup in nearly 4 months. And this time, it would be her decision. You said you transferred the house to your name last year. Margaret asked, her voice soft but firm. The question slipped gently into the room, like the soft ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. Jessica, sitting cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open, looked up sharply. Outside, snow fell with a kind of lazy determination, dusting the porch and dimming the streetlights in halos. Paul was in the armchair, scrolling through his phone as usual, but tonight his finger paused. "I did?" Jessica said, her tone brisk, perhaps too brisk. "We talked about this already, remember?" Margaret nodded slowly. She was seated at the edge of the armrest the same way she often did when guests visited. As if she might need to leave quickly, as if she didn't belong on the furniture for long. "I think I'd like to see a copy of the papers," she said gently. "Just for my peace of mind." Jessica laughed, a quick exhale through her nose that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mum, that's really not necessary. I'd feel better if I saw it." Margaret's voice didn't rise, but there was something new in it, something steady. Jessica closed her laptop a little too hard. "I told you everything's handled." Why the sudden interest? Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "You said it was last year, but I don't remember signing anything." For a moment, the room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Paul glanced at Jessica, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jessica stood up, smoothing her cardigan. "You don't have to remember, Mom. You were overwhelmed." "It was just paperwork," I see, Margaret said quietly. She tilted her head, her eyes on the snow outside the window. "Even so, I'd still like to take a look." Paul shifted. "Actually, I wouldn't mind seeing it too," he said, his voice lower than usual. Jessica turned to him, her mouth slightly open. "Why, I just thought we kept it in the kitchen file drawer, but I didn't see it when I was looking for the water bill last week," he said casually, but his tone wasn't as careless as he wanted it to sound. Jessica's smile thinned. "It's in the safe. I'll bring it out later." Margaret looked at her daughter without blinking. "Thank you," she said, voice smooth as linen. The tension settled like dust on furniture no one dared to touch. After a few minutes, Margaret excused herself and went upstairs. Jessica stared at the blank television screen for a long moment before walking briskly to the kitchen. She opened the drawer, rummaged quickly, then moved toward the hallway. Paul remained seated, but his eyes followed her, curious now and less certain than before. Later that night, the house creaked with wind. Everyone had gone to bed, or so it seemed. Jessica tiptoed down to the basement, wrapped in a thick robe. She flipped the light switch and descended the narrow stairs, the wood groaning beneath each careful step. She opened the cabinet behind the washing machine. The metal box was still there, the one with the peeling red sticker. She opened it. Empty. Only a few expired coupons and a key to an old bike lock. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the basement at the shadows cast by the single overhead bulb at the dusty shelves, the boxes of holiday decorations untouched for years. She was alone. Or so she thought. Margaret sat waiting in the dim light of the town library, her eyes fixed on the old wooden door. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, softened by the warmth of the overhead lights that hummed quietly above her. She wore her navy coat, buttoned all the way to the top, and her hands, neatly folded over her handbag, rested on her lap without fidgeting. She didn't look at her watch. Time moved differently now. The door creaked, and Grace Adams stepped in, just as she had sounded on the phone, measured, self-assured, and carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime around numbers and names. She walked with slow steps and a determined calm, her coat lined with small flakes of snow melting along the edges. "Mrs. Davis?" Grace asked, though her smile said she already knew. Margaret stood, nodded once, and gestured to the seat across from her. They sat at a narrow wooden table tucked between tall shelves of forgotten encyclopedias and town meeting records. The library was nearly empty, just the low rustle of pages and the turning of a newspaper at the far end of the room. Grace opened her leather bag and pulled out a plastic folder neatly labelled and clipped shut. "This is your copy," she said. "Notarized and recorded before your husband passed." Margaret reached forward slowly, as if her fingers might shake. They didn't. Inside the folder, beneath a cream-coloured cover sheet, lay the will, handwritten, signed in her husband's slanted handwriting, with a courthouse seal at the bottom. Her name stood alone on the line titled Beneficiary. There was no mention of shared ownership, no clause about redistribution. "He wanted things to be clear," Grace said, watching her reaction. "He asked me to witness it myself. Said he didn't want you to worry about anything." Margaret looked up, lips parting slightly, but no words came. "I refused your daughter's request," Grace added quietly. "She came to me 2 years ago, asking if the title could be amended to include her. I told her no. It wasn't her place." The air in the room seemed to hold still for a moment. Margaret closed the folder carefully. Her hands no longer trembled. "Thank you," she said finally. Grace nodded. "You deserve to know what's yours." For a while they sat without speaking, two women in winter coats surrounded by silence and the weight of paper. As they stood to leave, Margaret paused, then reached out and gently touched Grace's hand. "I didn't think I'd feel seen again," she said softly. Grace squeezed her fingers. "You've never disappeared. You were just waiting for the right light." Outside, the afternoon was grey with a hint of early dusk. Snow continued to fall, fine and steady. Margaret walked slowly down Main Street, the folder tucked close to her side like something precious. Every step felt both heavier and lighter, as if she were walking against the wind, but finally knew where she was going. At the corner, she stopped. Across the street was a modest building with frosted windows and a clean brass sign, Law Office of Rebecca Lyons. She stood in place, not moving, just watching the sign as people passed by. Her breath left small clouds in the air. Then slowly she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and lifted it toward the sign. A click. A photo. She stood there another moment before turning to walk away, her steps quieter now, but not hesitant. Paul asked softly, when there were only two people left in the kitchen. "Mother Margaret, have you really signed the moving papers?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She wiped the countertop with a quiet motion, the dish towel in her hand, moving slowly, deliberately. The kitchen was still warm from the oven, carrying the scent of roasted potatoes and rosemary. Outside, frost had begun to settle on the edges of the window, fogging the view of the porch light. Jessica had gone out after dinner, a quick kiss on Paul's cheek keys jangling in her coat pocket, and then the slam of the door. No explanation, just an "I'll be back late." Now it was just the two of them. Paul leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed loosely, his eyes following Margaret's movements, not invasive, just thoughtful. For the first time, his posture lacked that quiet indifference she had grown used to. There was a curiosity in his voice earlier. And maybe something more. "No," Margaret said at last, still facing the counter. "I never signed anything that finalized the transfer." Paul didn't respond right away. He stepped forward, pulled out a chair, and sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "She told me the house was in her name," he murmured. "Said everything was settled before I moved in." Margaret turned gently, placing a clean plate in the rack. "Did she show you any documents?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No." Said it was a family matter. She nodded once, then walked to the kettle, refilling it from the tap. The sound of water filled the silence between them. Paul looked down at the table, then up at her again. You know, she handles all the bills. Even my paycheck goes through her joint account. She says it's easier that way, but lately, I've been wondering. Margaret poured water into the kettle, turned the knob, and let the flame come to life. Maybe we don't know the whole truth, she said gently. Their eyes met. It was brief, but enough. Paul sat straighter. His face, usually unreadable, softened just slightly. Look, he said, his voice lower now, as if afraid the walls might hear. If you need anything, just tell me. Maybe I can help. Margaret studied him for a moment, measured his tone the way his fingers tapped nervously on the tabletop. There was no pretense in him tonight, no polite small talk. Just a young man unsure of where he stood in a house full of unspoken tension. She moved slowly to the cabinet, took down 2 teacups, one chipped at the handle, and placed them carefully on the table. The kettle began to hum behind her. Pouring the tea, she didn't speak. Only after she sat down did she finally say, with a faint smile curling at the corner of her lips, "Maybe you need to know something. But not today." Jessica knocks on Margaret's door at 11 p.m., holding a stack of old files, and says Mom left these in the basement. The knock was too sharp for that hour. Margaret had been sitting in bed with a shawl around her shoulders, reading an old novel under a lamp that cast more warmth than light. She closed the book, slowly pulled herself up, and opened the door. Jessica stood there, dressed in a satin robe, her smile stiff. "Found these downstairs?" she said, lifting a stack of manila folders. "Thought they might be yours. You must have forgotten." Margaret's gaze moved from the folders to her daughter's face. "Thank you," she said gently. Jessica stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, placing the folders on the edge of the desk. The night was quiet, too quiet. Only the soft hum of the heater and the ticking of the clock on the shelf filled the stillness. "I also brought this," Jessica added, pulling a single sheet of paper from her back pocket and unfolding it. "It's just a certificate of legal cohabitation, nothing complicated. Since we all live under one roof, I thought it was wise to formalize things. You know, in case the city asks." Margaret took the paper, her eyes scanning the title slowly. The text was neat, printed in a serif font, formal, but not too dense. Her hands didn't tremble. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness," she said softly, "but I'm tired tonight. I'll need a little time to read it thoroughly." Jessica waved a hand, as if dismissing the concern. "Of course. Just thought we'd get ahead of any future issues. You know how slow the township can be." She said it with a laugh, but her voice was tight at the edges, like a taut string threatening to snap. Margaret nodded and placed the paper neatly on top of the stack. "I'll take a look tomorrow." Jessica lingered. Her eyes drifted across the room to the locked drawer in the cabinet to the paperweights on the desk. "If you need help reviewing anything, let me know. I've been through a lot of documents lately." "I'm sure you have," Margaret replied, meeting her gaze. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Jessica turned and left her bare feet, making almost no sound on the hallway floor. The door clicked shut behind her. Margaret waited a moment longer before walking to the desk. She lifted the top folder carefully. Inside were forms, copies, unfinished contracts, all unsigned. The pages had been reshuffled, some upside down, others nearly blank, except for a few scribbled notes in pencil. She picked one up, holding it close to the lamp. In the lower corner, the date had been altered. Barely noticeable, but enough for someone with an attentive eye. The ink was newer, less faded than the rest. A 2 replaced with a 3. A month changed. She sat down, breath steady. Jessica wasn't panicking yet, but she was trying to cover something. Margaret gently gathered the stack, placing the altered paper at the bottom. Then she opened the lower drawer of her desk, the one she never used for anything important. Inside, she laid the papers down, then closed the drawer with care. From her handbag, she took out a small brass key and a new padlock. She threaded the lock through the drawer's loop and clicked it shut. It made a solid, satisfying sound. The old drawer, long forgotten, now held layers of pretense. But the real documents, the ones that mattered, were somewhere else entirely. "Are you sure you declared your mother's house number correctly?" Margaret asked, her eyes not leaving the screen. She sat at the dining table with Paul's laptop open before her glasses low on her nose, fingers tapping lightly on the trackpad. The room was still sunlight slanted through the blinds in narrow ribbons, dust floating slowly in the afternoon hush. Jessica had gone out again this time, saying she had errands to run downtown. Paul had helped her log in to the town's public tax archive, then quietly stepped away, sensing she wanted space. He didn't ask questions, only said, "Let me know if it freezes. It's an old laptop." Now alone, Margaret scrolled through the digital records. Her heart beat steadily, but she felt the weight of each click. Each line on the screen carried the shape of a lie or the absence of one. She compared the entries from 2021, 2022, and 2023, property tax filings, local address verifications, declaration of ownership. In 2021, the filer was listed as Harold Davis, her late husband. Everything matched. Margaret's name appeared as co-owner, Social Security confirmed mailing address intact. Then came 2022. Margaret's name was still present, but in the section labelled filer, the entry had changed. A different Social Security number. Her date of birth was omitted. The contact phone wasn't hers. She leaned in, eyes narrowing. There was an attached banking code, something labelled auto pay, linked via digital account. A second name appeared below it, not Jessica, not Paul, someone named Sharon Layton. Margaret sat back in her chair. She didn't know a Sharon Layton. Her mind began to move faster now, without rushing. She pressed print. One page at a time slid out of the inkjet printer beside her. 7 pages in total. She reached for a blue folder from her handbag, slid the documents inside, and took out a black pen. On the top tab, in clear handwriting, she wrote, "Evidence number 2." She capped the pen with a firm click. Then she leaned back, listening to the soft hum of the heating system. Outside, the snow was falling again, light but steady. For a long time, Margaret didn't move. She stared at the folder in her hand, not in fear, but in something sharper, something cleaner, a knowing. She placed the folder into her larger canvas bag, along with the first document Grace had given her weeks ago. It was almost time. Margaret left the house late that afternoon, scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, hat pulled low. She carried her bag close to her chest, taking the familiar sidewalk path toward the library. Her steps were steady, but her eyes scanned each corner, each parked car. Inside the library, she sat for only 20 minutes, pretending to browse, reading nothing. On her way out, she paused at the top of the steps. There, across the street, parked under the leafless elm tree, was a black sedan with tinted windows. The engine was off, but Margaret saw her. Jessica. She sat behind the wheel, motionless, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on her cheek. Her eyes did not move. They were fixed on the door Margaret had just walked through. Margaret did not flinch. She adjusted her scarf, stepped down onto the sidewalk, and walked past the car without a single glance sideways. She didn't need to speak. She knew Jessica had begun to watch. "Margaret Davis, I got your email. It looks like we need to talk in person." The voice on the other end was low and familiar, with a rasp that hinted at age, but not weakness. Margaret nodded to herself as she held the receiver to her ear, her free hand gently brushing the folder beside her. The appointment was set for the next morning. It had snowed lightly overnight. By noon, the sidewalks had been swept, and the small town centre bustled with cautious winter movement. The law office of Robert Kendall stood quietly at the corner, its brick facade aged with grace. A small brass plaque near the door still bore his name, though the lettering had faded slightly with time. Inside the room smelled of paper and leather. Rows of books lined every wall, their spines softened by years of use. A single green banker's lamp glowed on the heavy oak desk where Robert Kendall sat, glasses low on his nose, a stack of papers already in front of him. He rose when she entered. "Margaret," he said, voice steady. "It's been a long time." She gave a faint smile. "You knew Harold." "I did. He was always cautious with his paperwork, never signed anything without reading every word twice." Robert motioned to the chair across from him. "Let's see what you've brought." Margaret placed the blue and brown folders on the desk. One by one, she laid out the documents, Grace's notarized copy of the will, the altered tax filing the envelope from the basement, and the latest form Jessica had handed her. Robert read slowly, marking certain lines with a pencil, flipping between pages, occasionally murmuring under his breath. His brow furrowed, but not with confusion, with calculation. "These are strong," he said after a while. "The will is clean, direct, and notarized. The property title hasn't changed in the public registry, all still under your name. No transfer, no joint ownership." He paused, then lifted the forged tax filing. "This one's troubling. The error in Social Security and the extra account are enough to flag it. Whoever submitted this knew what they were doing, but they didn't have the authority." Margaret nodded. "There's also a pending request, isn't there?" Robert looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Yes. A request to transfer ownership to a joint account holder, Jessica Davis. It was filed, but marked incomplete." Why Margaret asked? Because no valid power of attorney was attached. Someone's trying to move pieces behind your back, but without your direct signature, nothing is final. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her fingers calm. "What should I do?" Robert leaned back. "We'll send an official verification of legal ownership and asset status request to the local authority office. It will place a formal freeze on any changes until all documents are reviewed." He paused, then added more gently, "You're doing the right thing. Quietly, carefully." Margaret looked down at the papers. All these years of raising Jessica, building a life, managing the small things, and trusting the big ones now distilled into manila folders and bank codes. "Robert," she said, lifting her head, "what happens if she keeps pushing?" He gave a slow exhale. "Then we push back. But legally. No screaming, no fighting, just facts." He tapped one document. "This is your house, your name, your rights." For a moment, silence filled the room, soft and respectful. Then he looked at her carefully. "Your daughter," he asked. "Has she ever forced you to sign anything you don't know about Jessica had dinner with Paul?" Didn't bother to order another set of dishes for Margaret. The dining table was set for two. Silverware gleamed under the soft yellow pendant lamp, and the aroma of roasted duck mingled with steamed vegetables and red wine. Outside, snow feathered down in quiet spirals, brushing the windows with a soft whiteness that made everything feel muffled. Margaret stood at the edge of the hallway just beyond the reach of the light. Her hands were dry, wrinkled from washing, folded neatly in front of her. She had just placed the last dish into the dishwasher when she heard the clink of glasses behind her and Jessica's voice cutting through the hush of the house. "Close the door, Paul. I've got a video call later. And please ask your mother not to walk around in the background." Paul hesitated. His hand hovered near the kitchen door, but didn't touch it. Margaret didn't move. She turned back to the kitchen, opened the old ceramic pot, and scooped a small portion of rice onto a plate she had kept aside for herself. They had ordered from her favorite restaurant, the one she and Harold used to visit every fall. Jessica had once loved their mushroom stew as a girl. Now she didn't even ask if her mother would like a bowl. From the kitchen table, Margaret could hear Jessica's voice again, lower now, but tense. "You've been distant lately, Paul. I need you with me, not questioning me about documents or names on paper." "I'm just asking," Paul replied. "Why not be open with your mum if the house is already in your name?" "Why the secrecy?" Jessica's fork clinked against her plate. "Don't let your mother control you," she snapped. "She's been manipulating you with her silence." Margaret paused with her spoon mid-air. She didn't frown, didn't blink, just breathed. She placed the spoon gently beside her plate and resumed eating. The food had cooled slightly, but it still tasted familiar. Across the hall, Paul sat still. His eyes shifted between Jessica and the empty seat across from him. "Why not just tell her what's going on?" he asked softly. Jessica pushed her chair back. "Because this house will be mine sooner or later," she hissed. The sentence hung in the air like frost on glass. Paul stared at her. He didn't answer. Margaret in the kitchen heard it all. She didn't stand up. She didn't storm in. She simply reached for her napkin, dabbed her lips, and sat for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the wall, silent, composed. Then slowly she lifted her eyes toward the dining room doorway. Across the dim space, her line of sight met Paul's. Her eyes were no longer hurt, but calm. Paul enters the laundry room looking for towels and finds a stack of papers that have fallen out of the washer slot with a red mark on them. The small laundry room hummed softly, the dryer thumping in slow rhythm behind closed doors. Paul bent to open the lower cabinet, reaching for fresh towels. As he pulled them out, something fluttered to the ground. A few sheets of paper had been tucked behind the stack, crumpled and slightly damp. One corner was smudged with something reddish, perhaps a marker or lipstick, he wasn't sure. He leaned closer. They weren't just any papers. The top one was a scanned copy of what looked like a will. His eyes caught the name, Harold Davis. Below that, a signature. And then another page titled Power of Attorney Authorization, with 2 lines of scribbled names and a date. He straightened. The signatures didn't match. Not just the handwriting, the ink was uneven, the alignment was off. And the date. The date on the authorization came a full 6 months before Harold had even fallen ill. Paul walked to the hallway light and held the documents closer to the bulb. One of the pages had clearly been substituted. The font was slightly different, and the spacing didn't line up with the others. A faint line where it had been scanned poorly ran across the bottom. He stood still. The dryer stopped. Silence filled the room again. Margaret was napping upstairs. Jessica was out at her weekend yoga retreat. The house for once felt still and unnaturally honest. Paul hesitated, then folded the papers and tucked them inside the towel pile. He walked upstairs, slowly, footsteps quiet on the old wooden steps. He found Margaret in the reading room, a blanket over her lap glasses low on her nose, a closed book resting against her chest. Her eyes opened as he entered. "Margaret," he said quietly, stepping in. "I found something." He unfolded the papers and handed them to her, his fingers trembling slightly. "Did you sign these?" he asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses. She didn't rush. Her eyes moved across each line, each name, each number. Then she looked up at him. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Not those." Paul sat down across from her. His mouth opened, but no words came. The implications pressed on his chest like weight. He stared at the papers again. So, what should I do? Margaret folded the pages neatly and laid them on the table beside her. Wait another day, she said. Her voice was calm, almost maternal. Everything will be clear. Before you say anything more, I have something to say too. Margaret gently put the briefcase on the table. The living room was dimly lit by the old floor lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the rug. The scent of dinner-leftover stew reheated in the microwave still lingered faintly, mingling with the hush of a cold winter evening. Jessica had just returned from work, coat draped over the arm of the couch heels, still clicking impatiently on the hardwood. Margaret sat at the edge of her armchair, her back straight. In front of her was the old brown briefcase, its corners frayed the clasp, slightly rusted. She had carried it out from her room with both hands, carefully like one might carry a box of photographs or an urn of memories. Jessica sighed, arms crossed. Mum, I've had a long day. Margaret raised a hand, gently interrupting. Before you say anything more, I have something to say too. Paul sat silently on the adjacent armchair. His eyes flicked from Margaret to Jessica, then back again. He didn't speak. Margaret slowly opened the briefcase. Inside were neatly organized folders. She pulled the first one out. This, she said, placing it on the coffee table, is your father's original will. Signed, sealed, and notarized. It names me as the sole owner of this property. There was no joint clause, no secondary beneficiary. Jessica stiffened. I already told you the house was transferred to me. Margaret opened a second folder. This is the tax record from 2022, filed under your name. But see here? She pointed with her finger, calm and unwavering. This social security number isn't yours, it's mine. And the filing shows an additional bank account that was never declared before, attached without my consent. Jessica's mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing. Margaret continued, her voice quiet. There's a discrepancy in the filing address, too. You submitted it 2 weeks before your father passed, though we hadn't even begun probate procedures. Jessica snapped upright. Are you trying to humiliate me? Paul leaned forward. Jessica, he said carefully, why did you declare the assets in your mum's name and then try to switch them after the fact? Jessica's voice cracked. I just wanted to secure our future. Okay, I've been the one paying bills, holding this place together. I deserved to, by stealing. Margaret asked gently. Jessica's face turned red. Her eyes darted from Paul to Margaret and back again. Her lip trembled, not from sorrow, but from fury. You think you're clever. You think you're winning, she spat. You're wrong. She stormed up from the couch, grabbed her coat, and stomped toward the stairs. The final slam of her bedroom door reverberated through the old wooden frame. Silence settled. Paul sat for a moment longer. Then he turned to Margaret. You should keep this house, he said slowly. It's yours, and it always was. You want to keep the house. Then you keep this naughty daughter too, Jessica said, tears not falling. The morning was quiet, too quiet for a house that once held laughter. Outside, frost still clung to the edges of the porch railing. Inside, the sound of a zipper slicing through silence was the only sign of movement. Jessica moved briskly, pulling sweaters, jackets, and documents into 2 suitcases laid open on the floor. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a thin scarf wrapped around her shoulders. She did not rise, did not speak. Her hands rested in her lap, her gaze unfixed, resting somewhere between the steam curling from the teapot and the window where the sky slowly lightened. Paul leaned against the doorway, his arms folded. His presence was quiet, observational. His face betrayed no emotion, yet something in his posture spoke of heaviness. Jessica moved from room to room like a shadow, searching for its source. Finally, she stood in the living room, suitcase handles clenched in her fists. "You never trusted me," she said, her voice sharp but wavering. "You always thought I was the selfish one. You don't even know how hard I've worked." Margaret lifted her eyes, slow and steady. "Love does not allow anyone to deceive others," she said. The words were not angry, not judgmental, just plain like truth spoken aloud. Jessica's lips pressed together. "Don't pretend like you were perfect. You were always cold, always distant." Margaret said nothing. Jessica looked around the house, her childhood bedroom now barren, the hallway where her father's coat once hung, the old rug with the frayed edge near the bookshelf. She blinked hard, but the tears still didn't come. "From now on," she said bitterly, "you live alone." She wheeled the suitcases toward the front door. It took both hands to pull them over the small threshold. When the door shut behind her, it wasn't a slam, just a firm, final click. Margaret remained seated for a long moment. Then, with slow precision, she stood and walked to the stove. The teapot had begun to cool. She poured a bit more water into it from the kettle, letting the steam rise again. It was an old habit, something she had done for decades, regardless of who stayed and who left. She didn't look toward the door. There was no need. Paul entered the kitchen, his keys in hand. He set them on the table quietly. "I will go back to my hometown for a few weeks. But don't be afraid, Mom," he said. His voice was low, steady. "You have everything back now." Margaret went to the backyard and sat down on the wooden chair her ex-husband had repaired. The cold was still on the armrests. The early spring air was soft, holding a kind of forgiveness that winter never knew. The apple tree had begun to bloom, just the first few white-pink blossoms scattered along the lower branches. From where she sat, Margaret could see the edges of the yard, still damp with melted frost, the grass slowly waking up. She wrapped a shawl loosely around her shoulders and held her teacup with both hands, not to warm herself, but simply because she liked the weight of it. The house behind her was still. No footsteps, no raised voices, no sudden crashes of ceramic or slammed doors. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that had form and texture like wool, something you could wrap around yourself. She had rewritten the will that morning. It sat sealed on her desk, addressed to the local community foundation, earmarked for programs supporting elderly women who had nowhere to go. No family, no safety net. She didn't want her house to become a battlefield again. Better it serve someone who needed a safe place to breathe. The drawers in her bedroom were half empty now. She had thrown out old warranties, torn grocery lists, and yellowed receipts. But in the smallest drawer, she'd kept one envelope, her husband's handwriting on the front. It had no date, just her name, Margaret. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She remembered every word he had written to her over the years. Some things were better kept sealed. Not because of pain, but because the memory was warmer that way. The mail had come earlier. Paul's handwriting unmistakable. A postcard hand-drawn with a tree on it. "Take care of the apple tree," it read. "It lives long thanks to you." She smiled softly. She took another sip of tea. It was no longer hot, but it didn't matter. For once, it didn't feel like a forgotten cup abandoned on a table while life happened somewhere else. It felt like it belonged right where it was, like she did. Margaret rose, walked back inside, and stood before the fireplace. She held a single folded note, familiar words, scratched in haste and anger. "Get a job, or get out." She dropped it into the fire. The flames took it quickly, curling the edges, reducing it to silence. She returned to the backyard. The wooden chair greeted her like an old friend. The sunlight filtered gently through the thin clouds, warming her knees and her hands. She tilted her head slightly, letting the light play against the silver strands of her hair. No titles today. Not mother, not burden, not nuisance, just Margaret. After all the accusations faded and the doors stopped slamming, Margaret remained unchanged in truth, but transformed in presence. She had lost many words over the years, yet found her dignity in the silence between them. Justice may come quietly, but it never forgets its path. Sometimes, to reclaim what's yours, you only need to stop retreating. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.